Hello, YouTube. Among the names of famous Russians who possessed esoteric knowledge, the name of Yakov Bruce stands out. The direct heir to the Scottish throne, his ancestors fled Great Britain from the Cromwellian terror. Count Yakov Vilimovich Bruce was an engineer, inventor, mathematician, astronomer, medicine man, topographer, military leader, politician, natural scientist like biologist. And he also was a diplomat. And according to contemporaries, he was a sorcerer, a magician, a warlock, a practitioner of black magic. Bruce was one of the most educated people in Russia, and he owned the largest library, numbering about 1,500 volumes, almost exclusively scientific, technical, and reference content. In 1696, he compiled the map of the lands from Moscow to Asia Minor, and in 1702, he opened the first observatory in Russia at the Navigation School in Moscow. The school was located in the Sukharev Tower, built in 1695, and strongly contrasted with the architecture of the patriarchal Moscow. Count Bruce proved his loyalty to the Tsar. That's how we refer to the Russian king. Even during the Streltsy, or Royal Musketeers riot, when the young Russian Scot came to the rescue of the future Tsar in the Trinity Sergius Monastery. Yakov was fluent in 6 European languages, and his cabinet of curious things was the only one of its kind in Russia, and his exhibits were included in the Kunstkamera of the Academy of Sciences after Bruce's death. You can find out more about this macabre museum in my video, and you will find the link to that video in the description to this one. First, let's briefly analyze his official biography. So what do we know from official historical documents? The Bruce family is one of the most ancient and famous in Europe. Natives of Normandy, the Bruces, trace their ancestry back to the first centuries of the Common Era. One of the significant events in this history is the Norman conquest of England, which took place in the middle of the 11th century. It was then that Robert de Bruce, a nobleman from Cotentin, moved to England and took possession of land in Yorkshire. To his son, Robert de Bruce, King David I of Scotland granted in 1824 the valley of the Annan River in the southwestern part of the country. Jacob, or rather James Daniel Bruce, born 1669, Moscow, died in 1735 at the Glinka Manor Estate, now Shelkovitsky district of the Moscow region. He was a Russian statesman, military and scientist leader, one of the closest associates of Peter the Great, a representative of the noble Scottish Bruce family, the younger brother of Roman Vilimovich Bruce, the first chief commandant of St. Petersburg. The ancestors of Yakov Bruce lived in Russia since 1647. And of course, it must be mentioned that he was a direct descendant of the great Scottish King Bruce. So he had royal bloodlines to the brim, so to say. The wife of Yakov Bruce was Ekaterina Alexeyevna Dolgorukova, princess, once a bride of Peter II. In 1721, at the conclusion of the Peace of Nystadt, Bruce received the dignity of a count of the Russian Empire and a state of 500 peasant households. Let's look at other sources. Yakov Vilimovich Bruce was born in Moscow in May of 1669. He was 3 years older than Peter I, or as you know him in the West, Peter the Great. They were people of the same generation. Maybe this influenced their coming together in the 1690s. In any case, in spirit, in the desire to always comprehend something new, to constantly learn something, they were certainly similar. At the age of 14, Bruce spoke 3 languages. The rest he must have learned later. He knew mathematics and astronomy. At the age of 16, Bruce enlisted in the so-called entertaining troops created by Peter the Great. Later, they became real troops. When the young monarch flexed his power, the young sovereign, eager for knowledge, singled out the enlightened Scot. Having entered the service of Peter, Bruce was rapidly climbing the career ladder. He headed the entire Russian artillery. At the age of 30, he received the rank of field marshal, participated in all the military campaigns of the Tsar. Peter took the enlightened foreigner to, although he was born in Russia, he was still considered to be a foreigner, to important diplomatic negotiations. Yakov Bruce became the first person to be granted the main award of the empire, the Order of St. Andrew. Well, his father arrived in Russia in 1647, where he served in the army and received the rank of colonel. William, or pronounced as William. Bruce was married since 1639 and rented a small plot of land, which he eventually lost. He was born in the early 1620s into a Protestant family in Scotland, in the county of Clackmannan, on the northern shore of the Forth. I may not pronounce it right, but that's what I have. Participated on the side of the king in the civil war between Charles I and Parliament in the 1640s. After the defeat of the royal troops at the Battle of Neseby on June 14, 1645, many supporters of the king began to leave their homeland. In many ways, this circumstance was the reason for his departure to the continent in 1647. The Russian Tsar's representative, Ilya Danilovich Miloslavsky, was recruiting foreign officers for the Russian service at that time. Among them was William Bruce. His son, Yakov, also chose a military career. He participated in Peter's campaigns, commanded artillery, and by the age of 35, he already had the rank of marshal. Bruce taught Peter to navigate the sky, predict solar eclipses. He never parted with a telescope and books, took them with him even to the war. At night, the Scot looked at the stars, drew something and calculated. There were legends about him, one more amazing than the other. We will look at the legends too. After Peter's death, Bruce at first also actively continued his studies both in colleges and in artillery, but then, probably due to the discord that took place between the nobles of that time, despite the monarch's mercy to him, he began to ask for his resignation, which was given to him in the following year, 1726, with the rank of field marshal. Since that year, Bruce settled in his manor estate Glinka in the Bogorodsky district, 42 versts Russian measurement of land, from Moscow, and lived there until the end of his life, occasionally visiting Moscow and indulging exclusively in scientific pursuits, meaning Bruce did not engage in the politics of the empire. He died on April 19, 1735, leaving no descendants. Bruce was buried, as can be seen from the report to the Empress from Count Saltykov, on May 14 in the German settlement in Moscow. The German settlement in Moscow was a real little Europe in the middle of the Russian capital. Foreigners did not change their traditions. They built houses like those they saw at home, spoke their own languages, and married only the same Germans, that is, not Russians. And the Russians avoided them, but Peter the Great spent all his youth in Kukuy, name of the location, where he found friends, had an affair, and fell in love with Europe with all his heart. Sretenka Street is a street in the Meshchansky district of the Central Administrative Okrug region, Moscow. Sretenka Street goes from Sretensky Vorota Square to Большая Sukharevskaya and Malaya Sukharevskaya squares. At the end of Sretenka, near the present Sukharevskaya subway or metro station, the Sukharev watchtower once stood. In the 16th century, there was a border of the city, and then the Trinity Road began. The tower was built first of wood and later, under Peter the Great, of stone. It was designed by an Italian architect. And this is there that Peter settled his colleague, the famous warlock Yakov Bruce. And under Bruce, Colonel Sukharev troops were stationed in the barracks in the tower. Now, Muscovites have long avoided the Streltsy barracks, where Colonel Sukharev's unit was located. Reckless Streltsy, the Russian musketeers, could get drunk and take away their money or even break their heads. But the townspeople became much more wary of the Sukharev Tower when Yakov Bruce settled there and organized a school of mathematical and navigational sciences at the behest of the Russian monarch. And on the top floors, he set up an observatory. The observatory's window, which glowed every night, quickly assured Muscovites that something fishy was taking place there. Well, Yakov Bruce also settled there and organized, like I said, at the behest of the Tsar, a school of mathematical and navigational sciences. And on the top floor, the observations made by Bruce in the first years of his studies in astronomy were serious and deserved great attention, as is confirmed by this fact. In 1803, the French astronomer Joseph Jérôme Lalande published the widely known history of astronomy at the time, setting out in the latter a chronicle of events in observational astronomy from ancient times to the end of the 18th century. He indicated in an entry under the year 1700 that this year Bruce made some observations in St. Petersburg. It is not known exactly what observations Bruce made or had in mind. However, if they had no scientific significance, it is unlikely that he would have included them, that the Frenchman would have included them in his chronicle, where they noted only what was really of interest to the history of astronomy. But I know what he observed in the years 1704 and 1716, and I will tell you later. Under the Soviet dictator Joseph Stalin, the tower was dismantled, but today the plans are to restore it. But as if something stands in the way of these plans, for many years the Moscow government has been supporting the idea of reconstruction and then rejecting it. Maybe because, some ask, of the otherworldly or supernatural forces. Sometimes in the doorways of the Sretenka they see a strange, lean old man in old-fashioned clothes and a powdered wig. It's as if this is Yakov Bruce, who is left now without a shelter. The Sukharev Tower, where Bruce used to do his scientific research, was sealed off after his death. When it was finally opened, the legend says they found in the cache ancient books of magical content that no one could read. Subsequently, Stalin ordered the destruction of the Sukharev Tower because it allegedly interfered with traffic. But it was rumored that it was actually related to Bruce's legacy. According to Stalin, the 300-year-old tower interfered with the development of traffic on Sukharevskaya Square and had to be demolished. Well, famous architects, and I got to tell you, brave people, including Fomin and Zhaltovsky, tried to protect the tower not only in words but also in deeds. To avoid demolition, eminent architects developed and presented to Stalin a project according to which it was supposed to cut through the 6 arches in the lower part of the tower, through which pedestrians and vehicles could travel. Well, here is an excerpt from the documented Stalin's response. Architects who object to demolition are blind and hopeless. Do you know what happened to people like that Stalin called Blind and Hopeless and so forth. Read the Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, so you understand what these bloody ideas and socialism and communism can do. The dismantling of the tower began unexpectedly and ended after about 2 months. Moscow historian and journalist Gilyarovsky witnessed this process and wrote, "Something creepy, crimson red, illuminated by the sunset ray of the sun, turned into a pile of ruins of the living. I still see it yesterday, a proud beauty, a pink tower." After the destruction of the tower, the Sukharevskaya Square was renamed Kolkhoz Square. The original name, the former name, returned in 1990 when the USSR was falling apart and the old idiotic ideologies were dying. There is an opinion that Stalin was trying to find an artifact immured in the tower by Yakov Bruce himself, the Black Book of Witchcraft. According to one hypothesis, this book was written by Satan himself, and it came to Bruce as part of the legendary Ivan the Terrible library. In Russian, the correct nickname of the Tsar should be Ivan the Fearsome. Anyway, it gave the book's master great power and secret knowledge. Bruce had a book that revealed all the secrets to him, and through this book he could find out what was in any place, what was taking place on Earth in any location, could tell who had what hidden where. You cannot get this book, it is not given into anyone's hands, and is located in a mysterious room in the Sukharev Tower, where no one dares to enter. The Russian writer Bogotyrev described one of the main mysteries of Yakov Bruce. Well, Bruce replied to questions about the book that he didn't have any mysterious books, except the philosophy of mysticism. In 1735, the sorcerer, as some called him, died, and Catherine I tried to find the book. She searched the observatory and turned over his scientific archive, and it's now kept at the Academy of Sciences. But there is more, of course, to the Scottish magician and military leader. During his lifetime, Bruce became the hero of folk legends and stories, in which he looked like an absolutely fantastic figure. He tamed an iron dragon, revived the bodies of dead people and animals with the help of living water. Amazing stories were told among the people about Glinka, where he lived, about the sculpture that turned on its own in the Glinka Manor Temple, the wonders that Bruce showed his guests at the estate. Muscovite candle merchant Alexei Morozov, for example, claimed that once at dusk he himself saw iron birds fly out of the astronomer's windows, make several circles around the building, and then return back. The next night, the merchant returned to the tower with his household members. The light was on in the Bruce's office. The figure of the count loomed in the window. Someone's anguished moans came from the tower. Suddenly, one of the windows opened, and 3 iron monsters with human heads flew out. Beside himself with horror, Morozov and his household raced through the night city away from the terrible place. Soon an alarming rumor passed through the city. The Lutheran from the Sukharev Tower communicates with evil spirits, and with its help turns living people whose moans are carried around the neighborhood into flying iron dragons. There is some truth in this story described by the collector of the Moscow legends, Pavel Bogotyrev, back in the 19th century, according to Zinaida Tatarskaya, doctor of historical sciences. In the Sukharev Tower, Yakov Bruce worked on the creation of flying machines. Later, I will elaborate on this, I promise. Like any self-respecting warlock, Bruce tried to unravel the mystery of life and created an artificial man, or human being, the same Pavel Bogotaryov recorded the impressions of Bruce's contemporaries as if the sorcerers had acquired a mechanical doll that can talk and walk but has no soul. An iron maid served the count in his observatory. When Yakov Bruce resigned and left the city, he took the doll to his estate Glinka near Moscow. There, this mechanical doll walked freely among the bizarrely cropped lime trees and flirted with the peasants. The serfs of the count, seeing the doll, first ran away, but then they got used to it and among themselves called it Yashkina Baba, or Jacob's woman. The most common of them talked about how Bruce designed a mechanical doll made for himself, giving her the appearance of a girl of extraordinary beauty. She, or I should say probably it, knew how to do all the housework. She cleaned the rooms, cooked food, served coffee. The only thing Bruce could not achieve was to teach her to talk. I believe what is meant here is that the mechanical maid could not carry on conversations like AI does today, but could utter simple words. She had to use them to flirt with the peasants and so forth. It seems that all the conditions existed to create such a doll. There was an idea, a theoretical basis, technical capabilities. There was also an interest, and not only because of the Tsar's predilection for mechanical arts. Many achievements of scientific and technical thought entered domestic use in a similar entertaining form. Think about it. Nevertheless, many young aristocrats tried to achieve the love of this beautiful girl. It kind of reminds me of the 21st century and the robots we're creating and how human beings start falling in love with them. These aristocrats did not believe Bruce, who unsuccessfully tried to convince them that it was not a human being, but just a doll. Desperate to explain anything, the count pulled out some kind of hairpin from the maid's hairstyle, and the girl crumbled in front of everyone, turning into an armful of fresh flowers. The suitors immediately disappeared, and Bruce sighed and began to reassemble his wonderful maid. Are we describing here an android made of precise electronics, thin wires, similar parts, maybe some that look like flowers? But did Bruce's talking mechanical doll actually exist? And there is some truth in this, says Alexander Filimon, director of the Yakov Bruce Museum in Glinka. After Bruce's death, historians found a diagram of a mechanical robot among his papers. I do not agree that there is only a grain of truth in this. I think it is absolutely true. And I found confirmation of that. But what did he find? Alexander Nikolaevich Filimon, director of the Public House Museum of Yakov Bruce, editor-in-chief of the magazine Sholkova. He knows. I do not know. But I think if anybody does know, it would be him. Now, let's speak about Bruce, the inventor, and his aircraft. It is not known whether his airplanes took to the air or not, but the surviving drawings really resemble the drawings of modern aircraft. These papers are now in the Russian Academy of Sciences. Unfortunately, some of the valuable documents disappeared without a trace in the 1930s. According to one hypothesis, they were stolen by German spies, quite active in Moscow, of course. And then, according to Bruce's drawings, Nazis made their invincible Messerschmitt fighters aircraft. There is a record in the minutes of the Chancellery of the Academy of Sciences of Russia that Mikhail Vasilyevich Lomonosov, fabulous Russian scientist, presented to the Scientific Assembly a working model of the apparatus which he called an airfield machine. This device thanks to the wound-up spring, ascended into the air to a considerable height or altitude, and was assumed by Lomonosov to obtain information about the state of the atmosphere at various altitudes. Surprisingly, the Wright brothers are still considered the inventors of the heavier-than-air aircraft. Well, this invention precedes theirs. There is a hypothesis that Mazhaysky, Russian aircraft inventor, and later Igor Sikorsky, the inventor of the largest at the time Ilya Muromets craft, and also of the first helicopters, that they built their planes according to Bruce's drawings. I do not exclude that Lomonosov used partially or completely the drawings of Bruce or his predecessors. Bruce scared Muscovites even after his death. His body had already been buried in the crypt at the Lutheran Church of St. Michael in the German settlement, but every night the lights still came on in the observatory. Muscovites said that it was the sorcerer's spirit guarding his magic book. Well, again, he died in April of 1735, leaving no descendants. Actually, there are descendants of his brother who are still living in Moscow, but I doubt that they would know more than other researchers. By the way, according to legend, Bruce died as unusually as he lived. It was said that the sorcerer died during experiments at his manor estate, Glinka. It was as if Bruce had ordered a servant to cut himself into pieces and then pour a magic elixir of external youth, made according to a recipe from that very book. The experience was almost a success, but when the body parts of the dismembered count began to fuse, Bruce's wife broke into the laboratory, killed the servant, and stole the elixir. The restless spirit of the murdered man, along with the book, moved to the Sukharev Tower. He was buried, as can be seen from the report to the Empress from the Count Saltykov on May 14 in the German settlement, which I already mentioned. The Count's title was inherited with the highest permission by his nephew Alexander Romanovich Bruce. There remained of him, as a monument to his studies, a library and an office of various curiosities, which at that time was revered as the only one in Russia. Before Bruce's death, he bequeathed them to the Kunstchamber of the Academy of Sciences. The composition of both is most diverse. There are books and maps numbering about 735, and manuscripts and tools and all sorts of rare items, about 100 in number. The Sukharev Tower, unlike other architectural monuments, was destroyed for an extensive period of time and painstakingly, said Zinaida Tatarskaya. Stalin, like many tyrants, was fond of mysticism and wanted to find Bruce's book. He ordered the tower to be dismantled brick by brick and all the contents to be taken to him personally. But the book was never found. The angry tyrant gave the order to blow up the remains of the tower. Soviet communist leader Lazar Kaganovich, who was also present at the destruction of the architectural monument, later told Stalin that he saw a tall, thin man in a wig in the crowd who shook his finger at him and then disappeared. But the leader of all peoples, as Stalin was called, still found some of the Bruce's scientific works and used them in the construction of modern Moscow. Bruce's grave was also destroyed during the reconstruction of Old Moscow. In the 1930s, a church was dismantled on the Radio Street and a coffin with the Count's body was found in the crypt. He was identified by a family ring. The remains of the sorcerer were never transferred. No, the remains of the sorcerer were transferred to the laboratory of the anthropologist and sculptor Gerasimov, well-known person. But the remains disappeared without a trace. Only Bruce's ring, the kaftan, and the doublet remained. The clothes are now in the funds of the State Historical Museum, and the warlock's ring was lost in time. It's gone. Of course, some researchers say Bruce did not have any book, but he didn't take his knowledge from the ceiling, as we say in Russian. Let's not forget that he brought a large number of ancient books from his travels in the north of Russia, which preserved ancient knowledge going back to the depths of centuries, to the origins of paganism and Vedic religion. An interesting fact is that the Church of St. Michael in the German settlement is the only church destroyed by the Bolsheviks in Moscow. But I would like to check on that, because the leaders of that communist empire excelled in destroying churches and synagogues at the beginning of their rule and persecuted religious people throughout their reign. I remember that from my youth in the USSR, how they were turning places of worship into warehouses. I've seen that. But the tower of the aviation plant was built on its foundation. I'm talking about that Sukharev Tower. In the upper tier of the tower, Bruce set up an observatory from where, according to Moscow legends, he released iron birds with human heads at night. And in addition, he himself, turning into a raven, flew over Moscow. In the basement, there was a laboratory where he performed experiments on alchemy and where the Black Book was kept. Such are the rumors, and according to the rumors, it could be used to open any locks and find any treasure. Before his death, Bruce allegedly walled it up in the wall of the tower. Other books, as well as unique laboratory equipment, astronomical instruments, disappeared without a trace. In 1934, the Sukharev Tower was to be demolished. For some reason, it was not blown up, but dismantled brick by brick. So there is a little bit of difference in the reporting on what and how it happened to it. But this is not my purpose here to study on the exact destruction of the tower. However, the Russian Empress Catherine the Great apparently had reason to believe in the existence of the mysterious book. And so that no one else could find it, she ordered to put a guard at the tower. At first, even the Bolsheviks, or the Russian communists, did not dare to remove this guard. Only in 1924, the post at the Sukharev Tower was dissolved and a museum of public housing services was opened at the Bruce Observatory. What else could you expect from the enlightened new communist regime? The descendants of the Scottish kings gravitated to the natural sciences. One of such scientific achievements of the Count was the first map of the Russian territory from Moscow to Asia Minor, which I said before, but he also compiled astrological and geological ethnographic maps of the city. Joseph Stalin was the first to use Bruce's astrological chart, according to Irina Sergeyevskaya, a Moscow city guide. Documents have been preserved in which Stalin ordered that the metro subway be built according to the astrological map drawn up by the Count. Therefore, there are only 12 stations on the ring line, like 12 zodiac signs, and the 13th Suvorovskaya cannot be built in any way. It was Bruce who argued that Moscow should be built on the principle of circles. It is most reliable geometric figure or shape. By the way, he did not like St. Petersburg when there is no ring structure. There is a hypothesis that the Bolsheviks, laying roads on the side of gardens and along boulevards, used his astrological testament. This is how the modern, I'll give you English translation names, garden and boulevard ring appeared in Moscow. The geological and ethnographic map has not been preserved. It disappeared in the middle of the last century, but its descriptions are in the Academy of Sciences. Well, Yakov Bruce in the 18th century argued that it is impossible to conduct dense construction and Dmitrovka. There are a lot of voids underground. They didn't listen to him, of course, and the houses on this street were already falling through. It is not necessary to build tall houses or buildings on the embankment of the Moskva River, he said. In the Vorobyov-Gory area, landslides are possible, and the new building of the Academy of Sciences, built contrary to Bruce's warning, began to be strengthened immediately after the construction, trying to stop the threat of collapse. Look at my video about that university. You'll find it. But on the other hand, Bruce marked this place on the map as the most suitable for studying, and therefore a new building of Moscow State University began to be built on Vorobyovy Gory under Joseph Stalin. It is best to live in Kuzminki, Bruce argued, and have fun on the Presnya. The researcher considered the land on which the Belый Dom, White House in English, but it's the building housing the government of the Russian Federation. Well, the land where this White House was built, it's to be most suitable place for entertainment and drunkenness. There are two frankly disastrous places on the map of Moscow, Perova and the beginning of the Kutuzovsky Prospect. Buildings don't fall into the ground there, but traffic cops or the transport police call these places Bermuda Triangles. There are more traffic accidents per day there than in all other areas combined. But the true glory of the magician was brought by the famous Bruce calendar, the first edition of which was engraved on copper plates in 1709, designed for 100 years. However, it contained calculations that allowed making forecasts up to the year 2000. Bruce's calendar or monthly calendar contained a lot of useful tips and messages, tables of days determining when to emit blood, that was the medical treatment of the time, to have a marriage, to create battles, to build houses, to shave a beard, and to think. Astronomy and astrology, chronobiology and biorhythmology were fancifully combined in such tables, although the author himself did not realize that he had begun searching for new directions in the science of man, which would be realized only in the 20th century and even then partially. The calendar includes astrological predictions by year and zodiac signs, weather forecasts and various events, as well as practical recommendations for each day. Many of Bruce's prophecies are striking and full compliance with today's realities. Just one example, for 1992, the calendar predicted the common people will suffer a lot from that. Every bread will be expensive. With the profit there will be those who will keep it for sale until winter. Recall that it was in 1992 that the market prices were introduced in Russia and most of the population was living below the poverty line. At the same time, Bruce was interested not only in academics, but also in the occult sciences. For example, he was seriously interested in astrology. I already told you about the elixir of immortality. Actually, it was originally developed for Peter the Great, but Bruce, for some unknown reason, saved it for himself. According to the will, after his death, his body should have been sprayed with live water, but the trusted servant was very worried and broke the bottle with the precious liquid. That's one legend. By the way, according to another legend, Bruce died as unusual as he lived. It was said that the sorcerers died during experiments at his estate in the Glinka. It was as if Yakov Bruce had ordered the servant to cut himself into pieces and then pour the magic elixir of eternal youth, made according to the recipe of that very book. The experience was almost as a success again. But when the body parts of the dismembered count began to fuse, Bruce's wife broke into the laboratory, killed the servant, and stole the elixir. And the restless spirit of the murdered man, along with the book, moved to the Sukharev Tower. Only a few drops landed on Bruce's hand of the elixir. It's just like a beautiful fairy tale, isn't it? Then why, when Bruce's grave was opened in the 1930s, one of his hands turned out to be incorruptible? So, when Catherine II, or Catherine the Great, became interested in the works of the learned sorcerers, the academic librarian replied in writing to her that he could not find the package of papers, but as it was valued at only 50 kopecks, it seems that there was nothing curious in it. Bruce's notebooks were generally valued only at 5 kopecks, or 5 pennies, and as unfit for any use, they were destroyed. Someone was very much interested in destroying all of Bruce's papers. Catherine II was also aware of this, and she wrote in the margins of the librarian's letter, "Who stole it? In my stable, an English horse was unhooked and sold for 30 rubles, which costs 500 rubles. But that was done by ignorant people." There was an opinion that most likely Yakov Bruce was still not a magician, a sorcerer, a warlock, as rumors attributed to him, but a scientist engaged in research in various fields of knowledge, including scientific forecasting. Perhaps sooner or later, other traces of his developments will be discovered and will benefit the people of this planet. There is yet another legend, or true event as far as it's known. At first, Bruce made a magic clock on the orders of Peter the Great just before the death of the emperor. The clock seemed to show where to look for gold and when to start a war. But the clock was lost somewhere in St. Petersburg, and one rich gentleman from the Razgulyai ordered the same clock from Bruce. Well, Bruce worked on the clock for a long time, but when he made it, the customer had already passed away, and his heirs only laughed at the sorcerer and did not pay for the work. Then Bruce got angry and said, "May this clock be accursed and only show bad things." And they say that before revolutions and wars, the stone from which the clock board was made turned bloody red. And they also say that on special days, instead of a clock, a black coffin lid with a white cross appears on the wall of the house, and the top of the cross indicates where the treasure is buried. And there were brave souls who found treasures according to the Bruce's index. But only magical treasures did not bring happiness to anyone. The treasure hunters soon died. There's an explanation, at least to some researchers. The house on Razgulyai, the famous building number 2 on Spartakovskaya Street, where the Moscow State University of Civil Engineering is now located. It was built in the 18th century by a representative of a rich and noble family, Count Musin Pushkin. And almost at the same time, one of his relatives married the granddaughter of that very Count Yakov Bruce. It is also true that on the facade of the building, between the windows of the second floor, the outlines of a trapezoid or trapezium board, resembling the shape of the coffin lid, are still visible. Once upon a time, the outlines of an irregular cross, the names of the months of the year, numbers, astrological symbols, and other incomprehensible signs were stamped on the board, and a rod was inserted in the middle. In the 1930s, connoisseurs or aficionados of the capital's history united in the society titled or called Old Moscow, and they purposely engaged in the study of the mysterious board. Just a few words. This entity was formed in 1909 as a commission for the study of the Old Moscow in the structure of the Moscow Archaeological Society. After the liquidation of the society in 1923, in socialist Russia, things like that could not exist, so the communists shut it down. there only was a group of persons interested in the study of old Moscow at the Historical Museum, which is in the same year merged with the Museum of Old Moscow, founded in 1919, and in 1924 it was formed as a scientific commission at the Department of the State Historical Museum Old Moscow. In the years 1926 to 30, it was a member of the Moscow Art Institute as just like a section, a department. In 1926, at the solemn meetings of the commission, it was announced that the trapezoid is an eternal solar calendar arranged on the principles of a sundial. You can find this in the minutes of meetings and materials for this society, stored in the Scientific Research Department of the manuscripts in the Russian State Library. At the same time, according to unofficial data, the number of mental illnesses and even suicides has sharply increased among students of that institute, and residents of the Razgulai, and the Moscow authorities ordered the signs to be chipped and the board itself painted over. But there are still rumors among the students at that Institute of Higher Learning that there is a secret room behind the blackboard in the Institute building where Bruce's treasures, magic books, are hidden. They say that some are still looking for this room. But perhaps one of the most famous legends is how Bruce froze a pond in the summer and skated on it. Allegedly, at the height of summer, in the humid July, Bruce invited many notable people to visit. They were offered all kinds of entertainment, including boating. Then everyone was invited to lunch, and after that, the guests went out to the park again and began to watch the festive fireworks, skating on the ice of the same pond, which turned into an ice rink in a matter of hours. According to another hypothesis, Bruce turned the pond into a skating rink in front of astonished eyewitnesses with a wave of a magic wand. And now let's talk about the idea about intelligent beings on other planets. Bruce, Yakov Bruce, was the Russian translator of the book titled Book of the Worldview or Opinion about Celestial Globes or Their Decorations by Christian Huygens. Most often the book was called Cosmology. The demand for the book was unusually high, and soon it was translated into English, French, Russian, and German. Bruce assured readers that he tried to convey the scientist's thought more fully and, if possible, to preserve the author's manner. The fact that special importance was attached to the publication of this book is confirmed by the fact that Peter the Great read the manuscript and the new preface, and perhaps even participated in writing of the preface himself. In Russia, Huygens' book has become a completely new genre of scientific literature. The introduction to the Russian edition opens with several quotations from the Bible, which are not present in the original. Thus, the reader is imperceptibly and gently instilled with the belief that the sacrament is worthy of surprise, so to say. Namely, our world is not the center of the universe, as it seems to us living on this earth. I'm quoting from that part. In fact, our earth is the same as other planets and revolves around the sun. The Russian translation begins with a blessing and ends with the expression Soli Deo Gloria. This must be how Bruce tried to give this bold discovery an aura of spiritual approval. Indeed, the main purpose of the preface was to smooth out the frightening directness of the text of the book for the little believing readers. Now, the old believers, Russian religious dissidents who challenged Peter the Great church reforms, they literally pounced on this work, and the unfortunate publisher spoke of this book as the work of the devil. The reason for this fear is quite clear, since the revolutionary idea of the whole book is expressed on the very first page. Any person who shares Copernicus' opinion that our Earth is a planet and, like other planets, revolves around the sun and is illuminated by it cannot, at least sometimes, not assume that other planets have their own clothing and furniture. Other planets should be the same as the Earth, since they also receive light from the sun, also rotate around their axis, which was proved by the discovery of Saturn's moons, which Huygens made, and their inhabitants in the same way as this our Earth. As long as the planets obey the same laws, there is no reason to believe that they should not contain other living beings. No one doubts that God created animals in America and in other remote countries at will, and they're the same as ours, and nature, strives for diversity. But we know that he did not do so. All this was just a prologue to Huygens' most startling statement. Planets are inhabited by planet dwellers who have some intelligence. Maybe the same as ours, hopefully better, and answers in the affirmative, since it should be if we will consider it in application to justice and morality or in application to the principle and foundations of science, for the reason that the purpose of the Creator was to preserve and ensure the safety of his creatures. Further, the author in his book comes to even more stunning conclusions with the help of the similarity arguments. If the fear of eclipses forced humanity to study astronomy, then astronomy should be even more developed on Jupiter and Saturn, since eclipses of their moons occur there much more often. If they have astronomy, then they are familiar with geometry, arithmetic, and optics, for the reason that the study of art and science cannot develop not according to the laws of nature. For the same reason, the planet dwellers should be familiar with the art of writing and painting. They also know music. The depth of the shock caused by Huygens' book can be judged by the complaints of its publisher, Mikhail Petrovich Avramov, who called this book satanic. According to the publisher, atheistic and blasphemous books by authors such as Fontenelle and Huygens lead to the decomposition of society. This translation belongs to the pen of Yakov Vilimovich Bruce, as Avramov's petition proves. In 1716, Avramov wrote, General Yakov Bruce presented His Majesty the Emperor with a newly translated book, influencing the Tsar as usual with his hidden and cunning praises, thus hiding godless and treacherous intentions. Bruce praised the book of this mad author Christopher Huygens, claiming that it is very clever and useful for the education of our people, and especially it is necessary for navigation. With such ordinary and godless flattery, deceived His Majesty. According to Avramov, the Tsar accepted Bruce's translation without even reading it. Addressing Avramov, Tsar Peter strictly ordered him to print the maximum number of copies, 1,200 pieces. But as it turned out later in the fate of Cosmology, Avramov's negative opinion turned out to be more important than the opinion of Peter the Great himself. Although Avramov had no influence at court, a lot depended on him, since he was the director of the St. Petersburg printing house, which was entrusted with printing this book. The Tsar was in Europe at that time, first in Holland, then in France, where he received an award from the Paris Academy for services to the development of science from the hands of Fontenelle. Avramov believed that one should not miss such a favorable opportunity, the absence of Peter. The Tsar is away. I read his book again and was convinced that it is in every way repugnant to God. I fell on my knees before the Mother of God with tears in my eyes, with a trembling heart and a reverent soul, and prayed, not knowing what to do. I was afraid to print and I was afraid not to print. This indecision was soon overcome with the help of Jesus Christ. He was visited by the idea to enlighten these madcap atheists, these beardless God worshippers, by reducing the circulation. He only printed 30 copies. And even these 30 he hid safely. Bruce did not know about this unfair game of Avramov and wrote to Peter the Great, who was still in France, complaining about an incomprehensible delay in printing. In addition, in the summer of 1717, Bruce was busily translating not only that book Cosmology, at the same time, by the order of the Tsar, he translated the Dutch grammar and the alphabet for children. Avramov told how, upon the Tsar's arrival from Europe, he took this extravagant book and with trembling hands put it in front of His Highness and told him that this book was the most disgusting to God, the most disgusting. It deserves only one thing, to be burned along with its furious lying translator Bruce. The Tsar ordered to return the Cosmotheros to the rabid translator Bruce so that he would send all copies to Holland, as well as all 30 printed copies of the book. Avramov's petition, written many years later, looks more like an excuse than an attempt to describe actual events, but the description of the conversation with Peter was hardly an exaggeration on Avramov's part. It was included intentionally with a very specific purpose, to show the importance of his role as a public censor. In all likelihood, Peter did not recognize Avramov's real goals, and the Russian population, who could read whatever little numbers there were in Russia at the time, they missed a great chance to learn of the probability of the extraterrestrial intelligence and existence of intelligent beings on other planets. Not that the inhabitants of the Western Europe knew much about it too. Let's make clear about this. As for the UFO observations, Bruce's letter to Peter the Great, dated April 15, 1716, has been preserved, from which it can be seen that on April 9 of that year he observed a flight over St. Petersburg of a bolide similar to the one he saw in 1704 near Narva. There was another phenomenon, he wrote in his letter to the Tsar. I am sending your Majesty a drawing with this. On the drawing attached to the letter, which was a small piece of paper, a zigzag line running from top to bottom was depicted, and under it the inscription, on April 1716, on the 9th of April, at the 8th hour at noon, such a shape appeared in the sky between the north and northwest in a lightning color and was visible for more than half an hour. This figure came from behind the cloud from the bottom up. Consider it the same custom as the meteor of 1704, which was during the Narva siege. Think about it, from the bottom up and for half an hour. A very interesting bolide. I'm sure he had other observations, just we don't know where they are, all of them. Or if we know where they are, we're not sure if we have the access to them. Yakov Bruce left a legacy of rare collections of coins and systematized minerals to the Academy of Sciences, and most of the huge library, like I said, 1,500 volumes. In his office, however, strange objects were allegedly found later. For example, a book consisting of 7 wooden tablets, with carved text in an unknown language. And in my books and videos, you can find out about other interesting discoveries, and some of them, of course, confiscated by the secret police, the NKVD, GPU, whatever it was called through the years. We know it as the KGB. But tongues get loosened. People talk, and sometimes information comes out. Anyway, to this day, there are those who are hungry for knowledge. Sometimes they embark on search for for Bruce's secret legacy. A mysterious book in black cover, where, as the legend says, he wrote down the magical revelations that the stars whispered to him. Or perhaps, it was not a book that he had. Maybe that's how it was called in the 18th century. But something like a laptop computer. However, there is still hope to uncover the secrets of the Sukharev Tower. In the 1990s, the so-called diggery, why don't you see my other Moscow videos to understand who they are? An amateur archaeologist, something like grave robbers, discovered numerous underground passages under Sukharevska Square, which could be accessed from the basements of the old houses located on Sretenka and in the nearby alleys. Almost 3 decades have passed since then, and apparently the city authorities are very much interested in the local underground, meaning what lies under Moscow, but I already talked about it in my other videos. So this is what I wanted to let you know about Yakov Bruce, and I wanted to do it for a long time, and of course, if there is more information ever comes up through the open sources, I will continue this story. But to me, he was really a very interesting person who lived in the magnificently fabulous and bloody and dangerous and exciting 18th century. And I've covered the Russian history of the 18th century. And there is more I want to tell you, because nothing is as simple as it seems, so to say. You see, there are rumors that Peter the Great, who returned to Russia from his voyages of learning in Europe, was not the same person who left Russia. And this deserves more time, video by itself. But if this is so, and Bruce knew him before and after he left and then came to Russia, then it casts a very interesting light on the whole story. I want to thank you for your attention to my work. If you can support me, you'll find the links on how to do it in description to this channel. Please kindly tell others about my channel. Please subscribe, like my videos, and I'll bring you more interesting stories from Eurasia and other parts of the world.